My name is Deborah Wallendahl, and as a Diversity Equal Opportunity Coordinator, I spend a lot of my time working with people about talking about the value of diversity and also helping organizations focus on becoming culturally competent systems. This session today is designed to focus on your role as a caregiver and the importance of developing cultural competence skills. First of all, I'd like to explain the meaning of cultural competence, but before I do that, let's talk a little bit about why this is so important for us to discuss, especially in healthcare. First of all, changing demographics. We know that the world around us is going to be very different. In fact, they say by the year 2020, almost 35% of our total population will be comprised of people of different racial and cultural and ethnic groups. We also know that our senior population is going to be increasing by leaps and bounds. Your clients and patients, as well as the people you work with on a daily basis, will come from diverse backgrounds and experiences. The second reason we talk about this today is the quality of care. In order to provide the optimum or best care for your patients or clients, you will need to practice cultural competency. And again, we'll explain that a little bit in the future. Third, sensitivity. In the simplest form, being culturally competent and valuing diversity will help you be more sensitive to the needs of those you are caring for. So what do we mean by cultural competency? Cultural competency is the knowledge, the attitudes, behaviors, skills, policies, and protocols, which means the way we do things, that allow an individual or system to work effectively across cultures in the best possible manner. It allows a caregiver to respond with respect and empathy in a way that values the individual in their care. It means that one has the knowledge and skills to work effectively across cultures. What are some of the key characteristics of someone who is culturally competent? A culturally competent person is someone who is aware of his or her own culture and values and respects differences. So you have a pretty clear understanding of who you are, where you come from, what things are important to you, and your own values. Secondly, this culturally competent person is aware of their own biases and prejudices and understands how they affect their interactions with others. It will be important to understand, as we'll discuss later, that we all have biases and prejudices. Third, a culturally competent individual has culture-specific knowledge. In other words, terms that are specific to a culture. So if we're dealing with the Hispanic culture, we might understand the difference between using the term Chicano or Latina or Hispanic and what that exactly means. Fourth, and I think one of the most important, a culturally competent individual can communicate effectively. That might not only be listening, but understanding and being able to effectively speak with people of different cultures. Fifth, the culturally competent individual is able to build strong cross-cultural relationships. That's going to be important as you're dealing with specific individuals because you're going to need to establish trust and rapport with those individuals. And sometimes that will create some challenges for you, but again, the culturally competent individual has a lot of tools and skills to help them adjust to those things. Sixth, the culturally competent individual is flexible and can adapt to diversity. You have to be, in a sense, willing to go with the flow. And while in your field it will be critical to do things a certain way, there will be important ways to deal with health care and the delivery of care to your patient or your client, at the same time you need to be able to adapt and be flexible to where that person is at that point in time based on their culture. And finally, the culturally competent individual is able and willing to be an ally to those who are different from them. And sometimes that's extremely difficult for us. We may need to come up and be an advocate for an individual who cannot speak for themselves. We may need to be there to be supportive and to help that person try to communicate to others around them. So I think it's also important in this next phase that we start talking about some of the barriers to becoming culturally competent or to valuing diversity. First of all, realize that all of us have biases, prejudices, and stereotypes about other groups. We'd like to think we're not, but we need to realize that we are. We're not born with them, we develop them over a period of time. So what do we mean by those three terms? Number one, a bias is what we call a mental determination of someone. It's a preference. It's saying, I'm biased towards African American people. I have certain beliefs about them, those kinds of things. That would be a bias. When someone has a prejudice against an individual, a group, or a race, it means they have formed an opinion about them before they even have the facts. We've made a judgment. It is a dislike or even a hostile attitude towards a specific culture or a group. Stereotypes, then, are the standardized or often rigid mental pictures we have in our minds about members of a group. When we act on our stereotypes, we ignore the individuality of the person who is in our care. It is really hard because sometimes we'll assume and make generalizations, and that's what happens with stereotypes. We assume that all Hispanics think alike, or we assume that all elderly people want to be treated in a certain way. And sometimes those stereotypes can get in the way, again, of treating the individual as a unique person. We all need to realize, as I said, that we have some level of biases and prejudices and stereotypes. It's how we act on them that is most important. Now, let's look at a few of the other barriers beyond those biases and prejudices and stereotypes. One of the other barriers that sometimes gets in the way of being culturally competent is a lack of real experiences. I can remember once going through a training and a young woman said to me, you know, I'm 41 years old and I've never had a conversation with anyone who is black or African American. She said, I've realized that I have a lot of beliefs about people who are African American. I've never even had a conversation with that individual. That's why it's really important to realize what lack of real experiences we have and how we can create real experiences for ourselves to reduce that barrier. Another thing that gets in the way is simply fear. Fear of differences, fear of the unknown, fear of people who are different from us, or fear of what we've heard about these people based on what others have told us. Again, we reduce the fear by increasing our real life experiences. And finally, another barrier to think about, and we'll talk about this a lot more later on in this session, is the fact that sometimes we have communication conflicts. Sometimes we are now not able to effectively communicate across different cultures. Our own way of dealing with things non-verbally or verbally sometimes gets in the way of delivering a message. So we'll talk about those barriers a little bit more. At this point, I think it also would be helpful to define two other terms as we continue to talk about cultural competency. What do we mean by the term diversity? Diversity in its simplest term means differences. We'll go through some more specific examples of diversity in a moment. Culture, on the other hand, is made up of the values, the beliefs, and traditions learned and handed down from generation to generation. We can talk about the richness, for example, of the Hispanic culture again, or we can even understand that an occupation such as health care or law enforcement or education can have its own culture as well. When you think of diversity, I want you to think about and have an awareness of the bigger picture. As I go through some of these different categories, think about how they might impact your work as a caregiver. For example, there is diversity of race. We know of African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and sometimes our understanding of the cultural beliefs of those races or certain things that are typical of those races